4 years, he dedicated his life to upholding justice in the courtroom, until one night, he found himself on the other side of the law. Accused of stealing his own car by an officer unwilling to admit her mistake. After a grueling day in court, Judge Wesley Gaines finally loosened his tie, sinking into the plush leather seat of his Mercedes S-Class. He let out a slow breath. The case he had presided over, a high-stakes corporate fraud trial, had drained him. But this was the work he lived for. Fairness, reason, justice. That was his world. The streets of Birmingham, Alabama, were nearly empty, bathed in the amber glow of streetlights that cast long shadows across the pavement. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for the red light to change. Then, suddenly, flashing red and blue lights lit up his rearview mirror. His brows knitted together. He wasn't speeding. Hadn't run a stop sign. So what was this about? A subtle tension crept into his hands as he gripped the wheel and eased the car to the side of the road. He knew the drill. Hands visible. Stay calm. Comply. A sharp rap on the driver's side window. Wesley turned, locking eyes with a uniformed officer. A white woman, mid-40s, blonde hair pulled so tight it stretched her features. The name on her badge, Doyle. License and registration, she demanded, her tone clipped. No greeting. No explanation. Wesley gave a slow nod, moving deliberately as he reached for the glove compartment. No sudden movements. He handed over the documents, expecting her to check them. But instead, Officer Katherine Doyle barely glanced at them. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, studying his face, his suit, his watch. "This your car?" she asked. He exhaled through his nose. "Yes." "Is there a problem, officer?" She took a step back, tilting her head. "Mind telling me where you got it?" His grip tightened on the wheel. He'd heard this line before. Too many times. "It's mine," he said evenly. "It's registered in my name." She didn't even acknowledge his words. Instead, she lifted her radio. "Dispatch, I've got a possible stolen vehicle. Requesting backup." Wesley stared at her. The accusation rolled off her tongue like routine. No hesitation. No proof. Just certainty. "Officer Doyle," he said carefully, keeping his tone measured, "if you check the registration—" "I'll confirm that when backup gets here," she interrupted. "Step out of the vehicle." He didn't move. Not yet. He wouldn't become another statistic, another headline, another man forced to prove he belonged. Then, headlights swung into view, flooding the scene with harsh white light. Backup had arrived. A squad car rolled to a stop a few feet behind his Mercedes, its flashing lights cutting through the night. Doyle squared her shoulders, standing tall as another officer emerged. Officer Patrick Harris. Mid-30s. Buzz cut. An eager glint in his eyes, like he was ready for action. Doyle didn't hesitate. "Possible stolen vehicle situation," she informed him briskly. Harris barely looked at the car. He didn't check the registration Doyle still held in her hand. His eyes were on Wesley. Not at the car. Not at the registration Doyle refused to check. At him. A black man in an expensive suit, behind the wheel of a car that, in their eyes, didn't belong to him. That was all the evidence they needed. Wesley knew where this was going. It was never about the car. "Sir, step out," Doyle repeated, this time her hand hovering near her holster. He inhaled slowly. Steady. Controlled. "Officer, I've complied. You have my ID, my registration. If you run my information, you'll see the car is legally mine." Doyle's lips thinned. She wasn't interested in checking anything. She had already decided who he was. "Step out of the vehicle." Wesley had spent decades in courtrooms dissecting cases just like this. Exposing unjust stops, proving racial bias, holding officers accountable. Now he was living it. But he wasn't reckless. When he reached for the door handle, his movements were slow, deliberate. His other hand stayed in plain sight. The moment he stood, Doyle seized his wrist. "Turn around." A dry laugh almost slipped out. Turn around. He wasn't under arrest. No crime had been committed. He squared his shoulders. Officer, I am Judge Wesley Gaines. I am not resisting. I am asking, on what grounds are you detaining me? Doyle's jaw clenched. She hadn't expected him to push back. Because I said so, she snapped. Wesley met her glare, unflinching. He had spent his career mastering control. In court, emotions had no place. Facts, reason, logic. But logic wouldn't save him now. Harris stepped closer, fingers twitching near his belt. Judge or not, you don't get special treatment, he muttered. Wesley's breath steadied. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He wasn't asking for special treatment, just basic human decency. Doyle's radio crackled. Doyle, status update? She hesitated. Because what could she say? She had nothing. No probable cause. No stolen car. Just her own unfounded assumptions. But instead of admitting her mistake, she doubled down. She turned back to Wesley. Put your hands behind your back. His pulse pounded. This was spiraling fast. And just when he thought it couldn't get worse, another car pulled up. This time, it wasn't just another officer. Sergeant Luis Ramirez had arrived. Would he defuse the situation, or escalate it? Ramirez stepped out of his cruiser, his boots striking the pavement with purpose. Mid-50s. Stocky build. Salt and pepper hair. A man who had seen it all. Unlike Doyle and Harris, he didn't rush. He took in the scene, Wesley's tense but controlled demeanor, Doyle's rigid stance, Harris's twitching fingers near his belt. What's going on here? Ramirez's voice was calm but carried weight, the kind of tone that demanded answers. Doyle straightened, her hand still hovering near her holster. Possible stolen vehicle, she said quickly. Driver refuses to comply. Ramirez didn't react immediately. He just watched. And in that moment, Wesley wondered, was this the man who would finally see the truth? Ramirez's brow creased. Driver, he repeated, as if just now realizing the absurdity of the situation. Then, almost as an afterthought, he glanced at the ID still clutched in Doyle's hand. And just like that, everything changed. His expression hardened. His jaw tensed. He looked at Wesley, then back at Doyle. This man is Judge Wesley Gaines. His voice wasn't loud, but the authority in it made Doyle stiffen. A flicker of doubt crossed Harris's face, but Doyle wasn't letting go. Her grip on control was slipping, and she knew it. That doesn't change the fact that... Ramirez silenced her with a look. A slow, deliberate shake of his head. No. Then he turned fully to Wesley, his tone shifting. Judge Gaines, are you all right? Wesley exhaled, but his patience was razor-thin. Sergeant, I complied with every command. I provided my license and registration. Your officer refused to verify it and instead called for backup, escalating a situation that never should have happened. Ramirez's nostrils flared. He turned sharply to Doyle, his voice clipped. Did you run his plates? Doyle hesitated. That was all he needed. Without another word, Ramirez yanked the registration from her grip and grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Ramirez. Run a plate check, black Mercedes, license number. He rattled it off. The response came almost instantly. No reports of theft. Vehicle registered to a Wesley Gaines. Silence. A long, heavy, damning silence. Ramirez turned fully to Doyle, his gaze cold. You had that information in your hands and still escalated this. Do you even hear yourself? His voice was quiet, but it cut through the night like a blade. Doyle's lips pressed into a tight line. I was just being cautious, she muttered. No, you weren't. Ramirez's tone was sharp. You were being reckless. But Doyle wasn't backing down. She had come too far to admit she was wrong. That doesn't mean the judge wasn't acting suspicious. Wesley stared at her, disbelief washing over him. Suspicious? For what? He let out a slow breath, his fists curling at his sides. Ramirez turned to him, his expression laced with something close to regret. "I'm sorry, Judge Gaines," he said, his voice low. "This never should have happened." But it had. And Doyle, she still refused to acknowledge her mistake. Which meant one question remained. Would she finally face consequences? Or would the system, once again, shield its own? Wesley stood still, his jaw tight, heart steady but heavy. He had dedicated his life to upholding the law, trusting in the integrity of the system. Yet tonight, he had been on the other side, humiliated, judged, accused. Sergeant Ramirez had made it clear, Doyle was in the wrong. But she refused to back down. "I was just doing my job," Doyle insisted, arms crossed, her tone less sharp now but still clinging to her pride. "How was I supposed to know who he was?" Ramirez's gaze locked onto her. "You weren't supposed to know who he was," he said, voice cold. "You were supposed to do your job right." But Doyle still wouldn't look at Wesley. She never had. Wesley inhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. "Officer Doyle," he said, voice measured, "I want to hear it from you. Do you believe you had legitimate cause to pull me over? Not suspicion, legitimate cause." Doyle's throat worked as if she wanted to respond, but no words came. Because there was nothing to say. They all knew the truth. The only reason she had stopped him was because, in her mind, a black man in an expensive car didn't belong. And now, standing in the weight of that truth, she still couldn't admit it. Ramirez exhaled sharply and turned to Wesley. "Judge Gaines, you're free to go." A bitter laugh almost escaped him. Free to go, as if there had ever been a justifiable reason to hold him in the first place. He reached for his car door. But something inside him stopped. For years, he had ruled on cases of police misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of power. And now, faced with it firsthand, was he really about to just walk away? Because if he did, what about the next man Doyle pulled over? And the one after that? He turned back around. "No." Ramirez blinked. "No. I'm not letting this go," Wesley said firmly. "I will be filing a formal complaint. Officer Doyle abused her authority tonight, and I want that on record." Doyle's head snapped toward him, cheeks burning. "You can't be serious." Wesley tilted his head. "I'm a judge. When I say something, I mean it." Ramirez gave a slow nod. "That's your right," he said. Then, turning to Doyle, his tone hardened. "And you'll have to answer for it." For the first time, Doyle looked uneasy. She had always been protected before. But would she be protected now? That was the real question. And Wesley wasn't leaving without an answer. Doyle's face twisted, but in her eyes, beneath the anger, there was something else. Uncertainty. Maybe even fear. She had walked away from moments like this before. A flimsy excuse, a quick dismissal, maybe a slap on the wrist at worst. But not this time. Sergeant Ramirez pulled out his notepad, his jaw tight. "Officer Doyle," he said flatly, "I need you to state on record why you pulled over Judge Gaines." Doyle's shoulders squared. "I told you, suspicious activity." Ramirez's eyes narrowed. And what exactly was suspicious? Doyle hesitated. And in that moment, Wesley saw it all. The calculation, the scramble for justification, the quiet panic. She had nothing. "No probable cause," Ramirez said. His voice was final. "None." Doyle's hands curled into fists. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "Are we really going to let people like him intimidate us?" Silence. The weight of her words settled between them. People like him. Ramirez took a slow step forward, his voice deadly calm. "Say that again." Doyle clamped her mouth shut. Wesley let out a slow breath. There it was. Not an ounce of regret. Not even a whisper of acknowledgement that she had been wrong. She wasn't sorry. She was just sorry she got caught. Ramirez turned back to Wesley, his expression tight. I'll make sure this is documented, sir. Wesley gave a slow nod. Good. But it wasn't enough. I also want to speak with your captain, he added. Tonight. Doyle's head snapped up, real panic flickering across her face. Ramirez didn't hesitate. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, patch me through to Captain Emerson, he said. We have an urgent situation. A beat of silence. Copy that. Connecting you now. Doyle's breaths came fast, her composure finally slipping. You're really doing this? She hissed at Wesley. His expression remained steady. Yes. Because if he didn't, who would? And this time, for once, the system had to answer for itself. But the real test wasn't just what happened tonight. It was what happened next. The drive home felt different. The streets were the same. The city lights still flickered against his windshield. But Wesley wasn't the same man who had left the courthouse hours ago. He had always believed in justice, in the law, in the idea that if you played by the rules, the system would work. Tonight had proved otherwise. He pulled into his driveway and sat there, staring ahead, the weight of it all pressing down on his shoulders. Would Doyle face real consequences? Or would she be quietly transferred, given a half-hearted sensitivity training, and allowed to continue unchecked? He had seen it before. Too many times. But this time, it was his name on the complaint. His status forcing accountability. And that sat like a stone in his gut. Because what if he hadn't been a judge? What if he had been just another black man heading home from work? No title. No authority to shield him. Would he have been arrested? Thrown to the ground? Or worse? The thought made his grip tighten on the steering wheel. This wasn't just about him. It was about every other black man who wouldn't have a Sergeant Ramirez to intervene. Who wouldn't have the privilege of walking away with their dignity intact. His mind drifted back to Doyle, her arrogance, her defiance, the way she never admitted she was wrong. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about a culture. A system. One that only changed when pressure was applied. And that was exactly what he intended to do. Tomorrow, he wouldn't just file a complaint. He would push. He would demand transparency. Accountability. Real consequences. Because if even a judge could be treated this way, what did that mean for everyone else? He exhaled, shaking his head. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, he wasn't just a judge. He was a man demanding justice.